Very warm welcome to you all to the second lecture in our series, Cambridge Vertical Readings in Dante's Comedy. We'd like to start again by thanking the Master and Fellows of Trinity College for hosting, and the University of Cambridge Italian Department, University of Italian, if only, the University of Cambridge Italian Department for sponsoring the first year of our lecture series. Heather and I are particularly delighted to welcome Matthew Treherne, a senior lecturer in Italian at the University of Leeds, to give our second lecture. Matthew co-founded with Claire Honus in Leeds the Leeds Centre for Dante Studies, which is a fantastic research and teaching resource, and I'd really encourage you to go to their website, because there's podcasts and all sorts of resources, not just for those people in Leeds, but also internationally through those media. And really, as co-director of the Leeds Centre for Dante Studies, he was incredibly enthusiastic when Heather and I approached him about collaborating on this vertical readings series. And before these lectures, we have workshops which are run collaboratively with the Centre in Cambridge, with Leeds, and with Notre Dame. So he's really been in on this project from the start. So we're particularly pleased he's giving this first lecture. Matthew is also director of the Leeds Humanities Research Institute, which I think reflects his broader interests also in the visual arts, in music, and in literatures other than the sort of literature of the Italian vernacular. And in Dante studies, his research, I'd say, he's done pioneering research really in Dante and theology, and perhaps specifically on Dante's use of the sacraments of literature in the Commedia. He's currently the principal investigator of a big AHRC-funded research project, which is entitled Dante in Late Medieval Florence, Theology in Poetry, Practice and Society. And his lecture this evening is on the second canto, so Inferno to Purgatorio to Paradiso to, and I don't know if it has another title, but a warm welcome, Matthew, this evening.
Thanks very much, George. And I always find that kind of introduction a little bit intimidating. I sort of think the pressure's on. What I really wanted you to know about me is that I'm wearing my favourite pair of shoes tonight. So I'm going to take every opportunity to stand here. Nice on. Really, I want to begin by thanking George and Heather for the wonderful invitation. It's a really great honour to take part in this lecture series, not least because I've got very happy memories of attending public lectures myself as a student at Cambridge. That was one of the great inspirations for me in really deciding to go on into an academic career. I haven't yet found the University of Italian to work in, but you're working on it here, I'm working on it in Leeds, and we'll maybe even have two before we're done. I'm really certain that the freshness of approach of these vertical readings will lead to some really quite exciting insights and ways of looking at Dante's text. It's a really nice change after the tradition of reading the poem canto by canto. There's this very venerable tradition of the lectura dantis, where we take a canto and we go through it almost line by line. And that too can lead to interesting things, but it can also lead to some really boring lectures and really boring articles. It's really nice to move away from that very familiar format. Although moving to an unfamiliar format is also not without dangers. So it'll be good. I think one of the good things about this lecture series is that we'll see the format of the vertical reading start to develop as we experiment with it, as we figure out really how best to do this over the next 3-4 years, isn't it? I'll try and be, just to misquote Peter Mandelson, if you'll forgive me that, I'll try and be therefore intensely relaxed about getting this seriously wrong. I missed George and Heather's lecture a few weeks ago, but I'm sure that they'll have offered some really interesting and important justifications for reading Dante's Commedia vertically. And I noticed in the workshop that people in the University of Notre Dame, as well as in Cambridge and Leeds colleagues, were already using this vocabulary of reading vertically, reading horizontally, as though we've been talking in this way forever. In fact, we haven't, right? This is something that you've brought to us, so this is already your gift to Dante studies. I don't want to repeat the kind of things that I imagine George and Heather will have said last week, but I would start just by saying why I think that vertical readings can be such a good way to approach the text, and also to signal that over the course of the lecture I'll be pointing out some of the ways in which I think there are possibly limitations to the idea of vertical reading, or at least the idea that vertical readings shouldn't be taken as a dominant form of reading. They should be put into conversation with other forms of reading, I think. The main reason why I think vertical readings are something that we absolutely should be starting to do is that there are so many signals within Dante's text that invite comparison across cantos with the same number. I couldn't think of a more elegant way to put that. I don't know if you've come up with one, George and Heather. I think this is actually a habit that Dante wants us to acquire over the course of the text, this cross-referencing, this cross-comparison. And as is going to become clear, I'm sure, over the future lectures in this series, there are several cantos where the textual echoes across the three cantiche are very strong indeed. We can think about cantos 7 of Inferno and Paradiso, for example, which both open with very startling utterances of very different types, mixing up languages and so on, where actually I think the linguistic form of the opening of the canto is so strikingly, startlingly different that if we didn't do a vertical reading of that, we'd be really missing something very important. And those instances are clearly very rewarding when we read them comparatively. But they introduce, as I say, a habit, I think, that we can apply even in the cases of cantos that don't contain so many echoes. And I think that's the case with the twos. I should say, by the way, when we were trying to think of a title for these lectures, and the best I could come up with for my lecture was "Don't Mess With My Tutu." But we didn't go with that in the end. Maybe I should have just let that quietly die. But I think with the twos, we don't have multiple repeated references, at least to my mind, across the three. But the signals there are signals within these cantos that we ought to be reading vertically. And I think that what we get in these cantos is a very rich and deep sense of why we need to be reading vertically. And in the case of the twos, I think what emerges really strongly is a whole set of concerns about how we read, listen, think, and learn. And I want to suggest this evening that these concerns across these three cantos are an expression of the need for a certain kind of verticality. And as I say, this is constantly in dialogue with the linear progression of text. I think that what the twos are telling us is that we need to put the linear progression of the text in discussion with other ways of reading, which are more vertical than horizontal. I'm not going to wow you this evening with a whole string of close textual echoes across the three cantos, which will convince you that a vertical reading is the only gig in town for the twos. There are some echoes, I should say, but rather I'm going to try and suggest that a version of the idea of verticality is itself built into these three cantos. So before we go any further, let's remind ourselves of the three stages of the Commedia that we're interested in here. And just for you, a bit of Blake. So Inferno 2 is set still in the dark wood, begins with a description of the end of the day, capturing the pilgrim's sense of isolation as he needs to undergo his journey. He asks Virgil about why it is that his journey needs to be undertaken, helpfully setting out, in a negative form, two precedents for a journey into the afterlife, those of Aeneas and of St. Paul. Virgil offers an explanation. He describes his own situation in the afterlife, tra color che sono sospesi, among those who are suspended, in limbo in other words, and then he describes the arrival of Beatrice in limbo, who explains that St. Lucy, or Lucia, came to her on behalf of the Virgin Mary. And this is what encourages the pilgrim on his way. He entrusts himself to Virgil and they go on. There we have the Beatrice speaking to Virgil. Canto 2, the second canto then, sees us on the shores of Purgatorio, sees us on the shores of Mount Purgatory. Dante and Virgil have, in the previous canto, encountered Cato, where Inferno 2 had begun with a description of dusk. Purgatorio 2 begins with a description of sunrise. A bright light comes towards Virgil and Dante extremely quickly. It becomes clear that the light is an angel guiding a boat full of souls who are singing a psalm. The angel makes the sign of the cross and disappears, and the souls who look confused, unfamiliar with the place where they find themselves, ask Virgil and Dante for directions. Virgil responds that they too, he and Dante too, are new to this place. And meanwhile, the souls notice that Dante is in fact a living person. They crowd around him. One of them comes forward to greet him, and Dante reaches out to embrace him and finds himself unable to do so. And the shade speaks, Dante recognises him, and it is in fact Casella. So these are the souls arriving, and he recognises Casella. Dante asks him how it is that he is only now arriving here. Dante asks him to sing a song, provided, he says, that memory and his ability to sing still function properly in Purgatory. And Casella responds by singing a canzone of Dante's, Amor che nella mente mi ragiona, a canzone which Dante had included in the Convivio. Dante, Virgil, and the other souls are rapt. Suddenly Cato reappears, telling the souls to stop being lazy, and the souls run off, as do Dante and Virgil. Okay, that description took ages. Paradiso 2 can be summarised in one word: moonspots. It actually opens with a warning to the readers of Paradiso, and we'll talk a little bit in a moment about that warning. Not the most promising start to a canto, or indeed to a cantica. Beatrice and Dante arrive in the heaven of the moon, and Beatrice then enters into an explanation regarding the spots of the moon. Actually, to describe it as an explanation is slightly too simple, and I'll talk a bit about what kind of an explanation it is. It's more than just an explanation. But why there are spots on the moon, the question that's been worrying everyone, I'm quite sure, on this November evening. Now, it's worth saying at this point that there's a great deal to say about how each of these cantos is read within a linear reading of the text, or a horizontal reading, if you like. Each canto contains several elements which are undoubtedly very difficult for us as readers, and challenging and surprising to us as readers, because Dante's introducing new things in them. For example, when I was starting to prepare for this lecture and I was looking again at Inferno 2, I was struck by the fact that Virgil describes himself as among the sospesi, as being in limbo. And as readers familiar with the text, we just accept, okay, well, of course he's in limbo, we know that Virgil's in limbo. Actually, that's an extremely surprising thing for us to be learning in Inferno 2 at this point of the comedy, when we know nothing about Dante's conception of limbo and the fact that he's going to do something quite radical with who he includes in limbo. The notion of Beatrice herself is defining and initiating Dante's journey. Again, we're familiar with the text. At least people like me who get paid to read it are familiar with the text. But that idea of Beatrice as being the instigator of the journey set out quite plainly who she is. Okay, your son Beatrice. And yet, at this stage of the comedy, this is a very startling thing to be happening. The arrival on Purgatory is full of surprises. We're only just starting to come to terms with Purgatory's position in the Southern Hemisphere, the fact that the idea that prayer is performed in Purgatory, I've already mentioned, that's something which is wholly novel in the tradition. And of course the difficulty of Paradiso 2, that whole discussion of moonspots, right? Anyone who's studied how to study Paradiso 2 is very familiar with the idea of moonspots. But that's actually a very startling discussion. I think the shock of the difficulty of that discussion, and also the shock that Dante seems to think it's worth devoting the bulk of a canto to discussing why there are spots on the moon, is something to surprise us as new readers in a linear reading of the poem. The whole difficulty of Paradiso 2 is something which I think is Dante is very keen to impress upon us. So all of this is a way of really for me to remind myself, I guess, but also to remind all of us that as we proceed with a vertical reading of these cantos, any vertical reading needs to be kept in a dialogue with the experience of reading a text through in a linear fashion. And yet, as I've said, there's so much in these cantos, or there's a certain amount in these cantos that invites a reading across the cantiche. And as I've already suggested, it's this question, I think, of how we read, listen and learn that is shared across the three cantos, and that's going to be the focus of the lecture tonight. There's something quite liberating about giving a vertical lecture, if I can call it that, in that I'm certainly not going to be able to cover every single line of every single canto, so there are going to be whole big questions that might be your pet questions to do with these cantos. Your pet lines are not going to get discussed. So I'm just going to sort of pick out these key ideas. And then there's time afterwards for discussion. Let's begin then at the beginning of the cantos, because in the case of both Inferno and Purgatorio, we have the passage of time being introduced. Dusk in the case of Inferno, dawn in the case of Purgatorio. I forgot to show you some pictures, by the way. This is Casella singing to Dante, and in fact this is all of the action, more or less, of Canto 2 of Purgatorio in a late 15th century woodcut printed in Venice. It's rather lovely. I'll show that again later. And here we have the ascension to the moon, the heaven of the moon, and a certain part of the discussion of moonspots, which we'll be coming back to later. So, we begin with the two descriptions of the passage of time: dawn in Inferno, dusk in Inferno, dawn in Purgatorio. And I think this is quite a good place to start to think about questions of how we read when we're thinking in the context of vertical and horizontal readings. Because in one respect, the passage of time, Dante's emphasis on the passage of time, looks as though it's an argument in favour of not reading the text horizontally. Okay? The forward motion of time is an idea which seems to be key in the openings of these two cantos. We can recall Dante's account in the Convivio of time as a figure of movement according to before and after. Okay, so the dimension of time is all about moving from a state of beforehand to afterwards. But if we look closely at how Dante is presenting the passage of time, okay, from one day into one night, from one night into one day, we can see that there are certain effects that Dante achieves by creating this strong resonance at the openings of these two cantos, Inferno 2 and Purgatorio 2. So here we have Inferno 1, lo giorno se ne andava, l'ere bruno toglieva gli animai, che sono in terra dalle fatiche loro, io solo uno m'apparecchiava a sostenere la guerra, sì del cammino e sì della pietate, che ritrarrà la mente che non era. So we have the sense of the solitude of Dante's journey being brought out here, as Dante thinks about how the start of the end of the day is a time when animals on earth, creatures on earth, are freed from their labours, they rest. Not Dante. Okay. The translations are all by Robin Kirkpatrick in the lecture tonight. How could I not include this? Then we have the opening to Purgatorio 2, where we have the description of the dawn. So già era il sole all'orizzonte giunto, lo cui meridiano cerchio coverchia Gerusalemme col suo più alto punto, e la notte che that's a typo, a lui cerchia uscia di Gange, for con le bilance, che le cagion di man quando soverchia, sì che le bianche le vermiglie guance, la doviera della bella aurora, per troppa etate divenivan rance. Hope you can all read the translation, by the way. I'll read in my slightly unpleasant Italian, but we'll have the translation up on screen if that's legible to everyone. So in each case we've got the forward motion of time, a new night beginning, an old day departing, a new day beginning, But also, crucially, we've got factors which seem to present time in a different light. In Inferno 2, as I mentioned, I think part of the power of this is that it depends upon a certain sense of a regular or repeated notion of time. Usually at this time of day, people are starting to rest, but I, Dante, the pilgrim, am having to break against that. So against the linear passage of time as a movement from beforehand to afterwards, we've got a sense of repetition set against that. At this stage, that's all. Okay, passage of time set against the repeated cycle of day and night. But this prefigures something a bit more meaningful, I think, in Purgatorio 2, because we have the first introduction here of one of the features of Dante's Purgatorio, which is that the poet frequently tells us the time according to the position of the sun in relation to Jerusalem. Okay. We've been introduced in Canto 1 to the innovative sighting of purgatory by reference to the stars of the southern hemisphere. And to reinforce this point, when the time gets told, we get actually quite convoluted descriptions of the time. So to say that it's dawn, we need to know the position of the sun in Jerusalem, and we also get told the night rising from the Ganges. Okay, so it's you could have just said it's dawn, couldn't you? But of course not. So against the pressure of the passage of time, the dawn of a particular day, we've got something else. We've got, if you like, the sense that within that moment of the arrival of the dawn, we have a different time of day too. Night falling in Jerusalem, day rising here. It's as though time itself is being seen under a different perspective, perhaps, the perspective of Jerusalem. And if it's okay to refer to a canto that isn't a canto 2, I think it's interesting to see how this is made still more explicit at the very end of Dante's journey through purgatory, when he describes the end of the day, just before he enters the earthly paradise. So here once again, instead of just saying it was the end of the day, he tells us that it was sì come quando I primi raggi vibra laddove il suo fattore lo sangue sparse, canendo ibero sotto l'alta libra, e l'onde ingangia a non ariarse, si stava il sole, onde il giorno sengiva. Okay, so it's the end of the day, but to tell you that it's the end of the day, I'm going to tell you the time in Jerusalem, I'm going to tell you the time at the Ganges and at the Ebro. So I'm going to give you the time at the easternmost and westernmost points of the earth as Dante knew them. And I think it's really important here then that when Dante is talking about Jerusalem, he's reminding us that Jerusalem he's presenting it as the site of the crucifixion. Okay. And it's not, I don't think it's stretching things to say that what he's doing then by setting the time in purgatory in the perspective of the time of Jerusalem is he's also setting the idea of time in the perspective of Christ. And this, what's really interesting in this particular example, I think, is that it reinforces that notion of time itself, because an individual moment within a day, seen from that perspective, it's almost as though it's taking in the whole of a day, an entire day. Okay, we have all the different points, middle of the day, the middle of the night, the start of the day, and the end of the day. And I certainly don't think it's stretching itself to say that actually, if you imagine as geographically, you can picture 4 points of a cross in these 4 points of the earth, the 4 points in time that are being presented here. Now, this notion that purgatory needs to be seen in some way through a perspective of Christ is going to be central to Dante's whole idea of purgatory. We're about to meet in Canto 3, for example, Manfredi, who's going to introduce himself through his wounds in a particularly strong sort of Christ-like moment. The suffering of the souls of purgatory is going to be explicitly linked to the suffering of Christ. When Foresi Donati explains that the suffering is in Canto 23, when Foresi Donati explains that the suffering, which is really no suffering at all, he wants to explain, but the suffering of the souls is motivated by the same desire as that which motivated Christ on the cross. But I think here the perspective of Christ is important in terms of what it does to this experience of time. We're invited to see time not just as a straightforward passage from one moment to the next, as one thing after another, but as somehow gathering together moments in time within themselves or within itself. This is in keeping with certain medieval descriptions of Christ as gathering all of time into himself. So Gregory the Great, for example, in his Moralia, says that Christ encloses in himself all of the succession of time. In taking on the shadows of our temporal condition, he spreads on us the light of his eternity. So what I'm trying to suggest, I guess, is that we're getting a further rationale for vertical readings through this deepening understanding which emerges across Inferno 2 and Purgatorio 2 of how we present the passage of time. You can see in Inferno 2 the beginnings of this understanding, at least, where a linear moment through time, movement through time, seems to exist in a sort of tension with the sense of time as a repeated cycle. Now, I promise that I won't neglect Paradiso 2 for much longer. I haven't even mentioned anything from it yet, apart from to be rude about the moonspots. But before we get there, I just want to suggest that this reading of time in the light of Christ is turned into a mode of reading per se. In Purgatorio 2 in particular. And I'm referring to the arrival of the boat filled with souls in that canto, where we have the souls arriving, singing Psalm In exitu Israel de Egipto. And this is a passage which has been described by some critics as being almost paradigmatic. Robin used the word earlier, archetypal, for the Commedia as a whole. The idea of the departure of the Hebrews from Egypt, sense of as a kind of model for what's happening both to the souls here. The Epistle to Can Grande, which Dante may or may not have written, says that the way in which we read this psalm should be taken as a model for how we read the poem as a whole. And I think that the sign of the cross, which comes after the psalm has been performed, Feci il segno Lord di Santa Croce, serves as a way of making sure that we're reading the psalm typologically. In other words, reading it not only as a narrative about a particular moment in the history of the Hebrews, but also as a prefigurement of the liberation of the souls themselves and a prefigurement of the liberation brought by Christ. The psalm itself, then, which we might see as a sort of soundtrack alongside Dante's poem, Dante sort of sets it off in motion, as we were discussing in the workshop, those of us who were here, sets it off in motion with the first line, and asks us to imagine it running all the way to its conclusion very explicitly. It's also offering us a further model for how we might read the text itself. A particular moment in time, a particular historical moment, then, this model of reading would suggest, doesn't only occur once before disappearing into the past, but rather draws into itself, contains within itself, other points in time. Now, this moment, the boat arriving on the shore of Mount Purgatory, offers us a bridge in our vertical reading to Paradiso 2, and the important moment, somewhat off-putting moment, of the opening of the canto and the address to the reader. So here we have the first 6 lines where we're told, Voi che siete in piccioletta barca, desiderosi d'ascoltar, seguiti dietro al mio legno che cantando barca, tornate a rivederli vostri liti, non vi mettete in pelago, che forse perdendo me rimarreste smarriti. So some readers need to turn back, because they'll find themselves lost if they follow Dante. Others, however, are able to follow. And lei a voi altri pochi che drizzaste il collo per tempo al pan degli angeli, dal quale vivesi qui, ma non sen vien satolo. Metter potete ben per l'alto sale vostro naviggio, servando mio solco dinanzi all'acqua che ritorna equale. Now, what's the distinction that's being drawn here between these two types of readers? It's often tempting, I think, to think of this as a differentiation between educated and non-educated audiences, as though there's a sort of hierarchy of intellect being put forward by Dante here. I think that's actually wrong, in spite of the very heavily obvious, overtly intellectual nature of what's about to follow in Canto 2 of Paradiso. And this is a case where emphasising a comparative reading across cantos, across the twos, can both help us and possibly help us a little bit too much, as I'm going to suggest. I've already tried to suggest that what we've got in the respective openings of Inferno 2 and Purgatorio 2 is a deepening understanding across the cantiche of the nature of time and the way in which time can be understood in the perspective of Christ. And I'm sure that here, the ability to see in time, per tempo, the Eucharistic bread of angels, the pan degli angeli, is also at stake here. But there is still more going on here, because I think we've actually had staged for us as readers a version of the distinction that Dante is drawing here between readers in Purgatorio 2. I think we've had a version staged of this distinction. He really doesn't give us much to go on here in Paradiso 2 when he tells us about the kinds of readers who will fail, does he? He tells us that they're in a little boat, that they want to listen. Desiderosi d'ascoltar. What's wrong with that? You find yourself asking, I find myself asking. But in Purgatorio 2, we've already seen different modes of reading. We've had a mode of listening, I should say. We've had a mode of listening which interprets the psalm in the light of the cross, as I was suggesting. Okay, so the psalm is one type of listening. The other example of listening that we've got is that where we have Casella singing his song. This is an episode with great tenderness, the friendship between Dante and Casella, Casella's contentedness with his lot in the afterlife. It's the first example of Dante meeting an acquaintance in Purgatorio, the first example of Dante meeting an acquaintance and not being kind of upset to see that he's damned for eternity. Dante asks Casella if he's able still to remember and to sing. He asks Casella, se nuova legge non ti toglie, memoria e uso all'amoroso canto che mi solea quietar tutte mie voglie, di ciò ti piaccia consolare alquanto l'anima mia, che con la sua persona venendo qui è affannata tanto. She says, if you can still remember and you can still sing, if there isn't some rule or some new law that's removed that from you, sing for me. And Casella responds with the song, Amor che nella mente mi ragiona, sì dolcemente che la dolcezza ancor dentro mi suona. Lo mio maestro ed io e quella gente che eran con lui parevano sì contenti come a nessun toccas'altro la mente. And then there is a rude interruption as they're sitting listening when Cato appears, il veglio onesto, gridando che c'ho spiriti lenti. Qual negligenza, quale stare è questo? Telling them to run off to the mountain. Well, I think, as I say, we're being invited when we make a vertical reading of the twos. We can draw a very clear parallel between the readers in Paradiso 2 who are in their boat, who just want to listen and who will be smarriti, and these readers or listeners of Purgatorio 2 who have appeared in their boat and who also just want to listen and who need to be restored to their path. If we push this vertical reading further, the parallel reading across Paradiso and Purgatorio 2 suggests that Casella's song is in some respects a dangerous distraction, one that requires the intervention of Cato to interrupt it, to set the souls on their proper path. If we just go with that reading for a little moment, what would therefore be wrong with Casella's song and with the mode of listening to it? Well, it's a listening which excludes anything other than itself, for one thing. A nessun toccas'altro la mente. It's also a listening which Dante says, flipping back to when he asks Casella to sing for him, it's the singing mi solea quietar tutte mie voglie. It was a singing which calmed all desire, as though it was in itself an end point for desire. It's important, obviously, to notice too that the fact that Casella's singing a canzone written by Dante himself gives a very clear autobiographical reference. We don't need to go in right now into what Dante might be saying is wrong with that canzone which Casella's singing, to notice that there's some, potentially at least, some sort of repudiation of Dante's own past poetic output in this moment. But I think there's something to be said for this mode of reading. I think there's nothing that I've said is wrong, I don't think, in terms of this parallel or vertical reading, but we're shortchanging Dante's text a little bit when we push it too far and we take it as the only thing that's going on. One critic has described Casella's song as being a siren song. Put it as plain as that. It's an article that begins with the sentence, Casella's song is a siren song. I think there are a few reasons to perhaps just temper that a little bit. For one thing, Casella's song demonstrates two things. As Dante the Pilgrim frames it, he says, "Sing for me, provided that you still have memory, provided that you're still able to sing." So when he responds with music, he's manifesting these two things. The fact that memory survives into purgatory, and this is going to be so important for the whole conception that Dante has of purgatory as a place not just of suffering or repayment of a debt, but also as a place where reflection on one's past life leads to inner change. And the ability to sing. Okay, again, another very startling idea in Dante's Purgatory is that Dante's Purgatory is a place of song. Okay, against the expectations of Dante's readers, who would be unused, I think, to the idea that Purgatory was a place where song, hymns, liturgy had a place. The personal connection between Dante the Pilgrim and Casella, the tenderness of the communal experience that's taking place, all the souls listening here. These are ideas that Dante is going to be drawing out across the rest of his text, across the rest of the Purgatorio. And Cato's attempt to rigidly apply rules in the previous canto, okay, when he tries to stop Virgil and Dante from entering Purgatory at all, that tendency on Cato's part has already been very strongly questioned by the fact that Dante and Virgil obviously overcome the rigid application of those rules. So, Casella's song is more than just a model of bad listening, but it also contains within itself, potentially, as the vertical reading offers, the seeds of a critique of that mode of listening, if you like. A similar idea is also evident, I think, in Inferno 2, although it's not quite as prominent as it is in Purgatorio 2, where the reported dialogue between Beatrice and Virgil contains allusions to some of these ideas. Okay. Virgil is told to go to Dante with his parola ornata, with his ornamented speech, to try and help draw Dante from the dark wood towards salvation. But we can be very mindful when we read vertically, comparing the twos, that listening just for pleasure, just for ornamentation, is in itself potentially a dangerous thing. And Beatrice hints at this when she praises Virgil for being one who vuoi saber tanto adentro, wants to desire, or desires to know so inwardly. She also goes on to explain that her speech is driven by love. Amor mi mosse che mi fa parlare. Beatrice says that her speech is moved by love, prefiguring, I think, the love which moves the sun and the other stars of the very last line of the poem. The grounding of all existence, the idea that the grounding of all existence is in itself love. So Beatrice's speech here is a manifestation of that principle. And Virgil's desire to know seems to present something of a model of positive listening. Now, all of this points towards a further related question, which is about the processes, the models of learning that we have presented in these cantos. As I say, we've got a hint of this in the dialogue between Virgil and Beatrice, reported here. But also, Inferno 2 is in many ways preoccupied by the very question of why Dante needs to go on this journey at all. His description of himself as not Aeneas and not St. Paul at line 32 does several things, but one of the things it does is, of course, to give us a sense of the precedents for Dante's journey. When he's saying, I'm not those two people, he's also, in a way, recalling just how similar he is to them and asking us to remember that. But it's also reminding us that Dante, or telling us that Dante is undergoing his journey precisely because he is not those two people, because he doesn't live up to those standards. It's his lack of qualification for the journey, the fact that he's lost, that makes him qualified for the journey, the right person to make the journey. And this idea, I think, of the learning taking place from a position, not a position of greatness or a position of high standards, but rather from a position of bewilderment, of lack of qualification, also emerges, I think, rather beautifully in Purgatorio too, where we've got a further staging, a brief moment where we have a staging of models of learning and of explanation. This is when Virgil and Dante, who are approached by the souls, who ask for directions. And Virgil responds, "Voi credete forse che siamo esperti d'esto loco, ma noi siamo peregrini come voi siete." So you think that we're experts in this place, but actually we're pilgrims just as you are too. I mean, it's a fleeting moment, but it's one of the most wonderful moments in which we see that sort of capture something of the essence, really, of the kind of learning that's going on here. It's not taking place from a position of authority, but rather from a position of having to figure out as though for the first time for themselves. And Virgil's sense of himself as a stranger in purgatory captures precisely an idea that runs right across these three cantos, that the bewilderment felt by these individuals is actually fundamental to the learning that is going on. It's a bewilderment that, as I've already mentioned, I think we feel as readers of these cantos. Some of the surprises that Dante includes in the text, as I've already mentioned. And in Paradiso 2, I think this is when the nature of learning, the ways in which learning takes place, very much brought to the fore. So I'm going to spend a bit of time thinking about the learning that takes place in Paradiso 2 now. We've already seen that there's a distinction introduced in Paradiso 2 between those who can follow Dante, those readers who can follow Dante, and those who cannot. And I've tried to argue that this isn't just, or it isn't an intellectual distinction between those who are intelligent enough to do this and those who aren't, but rather it's one that's associated with a particular habit of looking, habit of interpretation. And this habit of looking, this habit of interpretation, is, I think, also signalled as Dante describes his progression in this journey, as he describes himself as entering into the heaven of the moon. When Dante describes how he saw that something marvellous had tugged him in sight towards itself, and Beatrice tells him to look beyond that which has just happened, saying, direct your mind to God. Drizza la mente in Dio grata, che n'ha congiunti con la prima stella. Look beyond the miraculous ascent to the heaven of the moon, to God, who's made this possible. And the whole question of how Dante's miraculous ascent has taken place is used in a great move, a wonderful move by Dante, to open up the very question of whether he was there in his body. He associates the mystery of how his physical body has been received in the physical heaven of the moon with the mystery of the union of God and man in Christ. If you're wondering at this, he says, then that should enlighten us, accendere ne dovria più il disio di veder quella essenza in che si vede come nostra natura e Dio s'unio. He doesn't explain how his ascent to the heaven of the moon has happened. He doesn't even tell us that it happened in his body. He says, if I was a body. But he rather says that our desire to understand that which is incomprehensible in turn should increase our desire to see Christ, to be united with Christ. An encounter with truth not held through faith, not argued intellectually, he says, but known per se, in itself, will be possible when the person is united with God. So this is introducing a complicated interplay between ideas of reason, faith, direct knowledge of God. And this complicated interplay introduces one of the most difficult and to many readers the most frustrating passages, extended passages in Dante's Commedia, the discussion of why there are spots on the moon. If Dante had warned his readers that they might find themselves lost in the Paradiso, here we can see that he wasn't wrong. There's not time, perhaps fortunately, to go through the precise details of the argument here tonight. And I'll try and make my discussion of the moonspots as painless as possible. But I'll stick my neck out from the start and say that the importance of the discussion of why there are spots on the moon is not so much about the moonspots themselves, but rather it's about the kinds of intellectual moves that are required to understand this and any phenomenon. First of all, we have the way in which the discussion begins with Dante's question about why there are spots on the moon. He frames it in terms of the story, the folklore story of Cain being on the moon, banished for the murder of Abel. That's a view that's quickly dismissed by Beatrice. But rather than simply telling Dante what the case is, why there are spots on the moon, Beatrice asks him to present his view, and namely, that the moon is made of differentiated matter, rare and dense. She dismantles that view. She says if he was right, it would either be the case that there was rare matter running all the way through the moon, or else that rare and dense matter would be layered across each other as in meat. Okay, yeah, I try and imagine this not as rare and dense matter and not as like chunks of meat, but I try and think of tissue paper and white cardboard, okay? So, is it strips of tissue and cardboard across the moon? Right, that's the first question. If that was true, then when there was an eclipse, light would be peeping through the bits of tissue. Is it patches of tissue? Oh, I'm sorry, okay. I feel embarrassed almost getting into this level of detail. But this is actually telling us something about what's going on with this canto. It's almost embarrassing, the kind of level of detail that Dante goes into. So Beatrice's next idea that she's trying to dismantle is that the moon is like patches of, this is me, not Beatrice, but patches of tissue with bits of cardboard behind it at various distances. Okay, so that if you have an eclipse of the moon, it's blocked all the way through an eclipse of the sun by the moon. Okay, so that sounds a bit more plausible. Beatrice implies. Okay, so the dark spots would be where the light reflected by the moon is hitting the dense matter further back in the moon. So, having taken a deep breath as a reader, Beatrice says, well, I'm going to dismantle this by showing you an experiment, or getting you to try an experiment. Take 3 mirrors, put 2 of them an equal distance beside you, put 1 further away, and then put a light behind you. What do you see? She says. You'll see that the mirror furthest away isn't dimmer than the mirrors nearer to you. She then goes on to explain that the entire order of the universe is intended to produce variety in being. God's power and intelligence is one, indivisible, but the universe radiates those powers, or that power, into all things, sealing them like an artist. This, not the differences between rare and dense matter, underlies the moonspots. There's a kind of playfulness in Beatrice's account here, the ways in which she draws out Dante's explanations, imagines his objections. But this way in which Beatrice uses empirical evidence to dismantle Dante's views is also worth pondering for a moment longer. Notice that she doesn't use straightforward empirical evidence to give the answer about why there are spots on the moon. She actually asks Dante to see the limitations of his belief by using that empirical evidence. So the empirical evidence, if you like, points to the limit of what his intellect can achieve using empirical evidence. That works fine in the case of the eclipse example, right? We can all see how that works. If it was the case that there were thin or rare bits of matter running all the way through the moon, then you can see that light would shine all the way through it when you had a light shining through it. But the mirror experiment is slightly more problematic, because as lots of readers have pointed out, if I put a mirror in front of me, 2 mirrors to the side of me, and then a light behind me, what I see when I look in the mirror in front of me is not a light at all, but myself. Okay. I accept that there are ways around this, And again, this is kind of typical of the ways in which Dante's scholarship sometimes works. People have figured out ways around this, so you could kind of get up a ladder and put the light up high so that you're not in the way of it and so on. But I think an intriguing possibility, at least, is that for the experiment to work, you already need to be in the condition of Dante as he enters this realm of the heaven of the moon. You need to be accepted as light is accepted by water, as Dante puts it in Paradiso, in lines 35 to 36. And as Dante's already told us, this condition is as hard to understand as the mystery of the Incarnation itself. It's no accident, surely, that this mirror experiment, pushing us to the limits of where we can go with bodily sensory experience, situates us once again in a cross shape. Again, strictly speaking, to make this experiment work, you don't need two mirrors on either side of you, just one would do the trick. So it's as though to understand the full import of the experiment, to understand the limits of what we can understand empirically, we already need to be located within a cross-form shape. We already need to be within that condition which Dante has described himself as being. It's as easy to understand as fixing up a few mirrors in a dark room and turning the light on. It's as hard to understand as the Incarnation itself. I find that the dynamic that Dante's setting up here, I find it wonderful, actually. It's emphatically not about ceasing to question. We have to carry out the experiment to understand it. We have to be asking the questions. But the questioning is set within an acceptance of the perspective within which its conclusion occurs. And we can start to see, I think, in this experiment, something of a paradigm for reading and learning, which we can draw out nicely across the twos, the cantos numbered 2. The mystery of Dante's journey through the afterlife while he's still alive. This is a theme which recurs across these 3 canti. Dante's questioning in Inferno 1, why him when he's no Paul, when he's no Aeneas? The answer is, well, that's exactly why why him. The attempt of Casella to embrace Dante, the failed embrace, 3 times Casella attempted to embrace Dante. Virgil's statement that we're not there as experts, but as pilgrims, as strangers, travellers. And finally, the mystery of the ascent into the heaven of the moon, as comprehensible as, well, the Incarnation is comprehensible. The mirror experiment, showing the limitations of the senses and of the intellect. This is giving us the perspective that we need to grasp this journey, to grasp the kinds of learning which are going on in this journey, for us and for Dante. We need to be asking questions about why. But we also need to be taking on the humility that comes with the perspective that Dante is saying we should take. The perspective of Christ, which I've suggested is evident throughout the 3 cantos, seems to be deepened further and further as we go through them. Now, I started out by saying just how novel the idea of vertical readings of the comedy was. And I thought that perhaps, given that this is only the 2nd lecture in a long series of vertical readings, it was worth worth thinking a bit about what the twos tell us about the value and the pitfalls of reading the comedy vertically. I've got 3 concluding thoughts then in relation to this. First of all, the way in which, as I've tried to argue, the idea of verticality seems to be presented in the way in which time itself is presented across the cantos. There's a setting up of the linear passage of time against another understanding of time, modelled perhaps best through the psalm, the presence of the psalm in Purgatorio 2. The second thought is around the way in which vertical readings foreground some of the differences in the conditions in which language and action occur across the 3 realms of the afterlife. The conditions of the Inferno, far from God, with limited understanding. The conditions of Purgatorio, where the souls are saved, but are in a process of change. They're poised. The Paradiso, where the souls are at one with God, although the pilgrim himself, of course, is still on a journey. So when we're thinking about what Dante says, the conditions under which they're said, the conditions under which action takes place, are really foregrounded by a vertical reading. And the final thought really is that a vertical reading should always be held in dialogue with the way in which the text unfolds over time, over linear time. It's tempting to find in the later cantiche a sort of key for the earlier cantiche, so that in the Paradiso we find the difficulties, the perplexing moments in the Inferno and Purgatorio explained. Suddenly they don't look quite as difficult after all in the light of the explanations that take place in the Paradiso. It's tempting to think that. And there's a lot to be said for doing that kind of reading. But as I've suggested tonight, one of the themes which emerges most strongly when you read the twos across each other is that the process of how you learn is as important as the thing you learn. More important, in fact, I would say, in the case of the moonspots. In the light of Paradiso 2's opening, for example, I argued that Casella's song might look as though it's a very useful negative example of what happens when you don't listen properly, when you listen to a song only paying attention to the pleasure of the sound. But of course, remarkably few of the experiences of the pilgrim in the afterlife are merely emblematic of some greater truth. We mustn't lose sight that as well as providing some kind of symbol for an incorrect model of listening, what we have in the Casella episode is just, as importantly, a friend greeting a friend and saying, "Sing again, like I always enjoyed hearing you sing." On that note, I'm going to stop talking. I think from what George and Heather have said, this is a good moment for people who need to get away or want to get away. But there's time for some discussion about the twos. So thank you very much.